Thomas Hobbes, the man who mastered fear. In this documentary, we will break down one of the most extraordinary, unsettling, and genuinely consequential philosophers who ever lived. Thomas Hobbes, a man who described life without government as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A phrase so compressed and so devastating that it has survived nearly 4 centuries without losing a syllable of its force. A man who watched a civil war tear his country apart and concluded, not from despair but from the cold logic of geometric reasoning, that the greatest threat to human happiness was not tyranny, but disorder. A man who scandalized his age by deriving the authority of kings not from God, but from the calculated consent of frightened people. A man who built the concept of sovereignty out of nothing but human psychology and the mathematics of self-interest. A man whose Leviathan, that vast, systematic, terrifying masterwork, remains the most powerful argument ever constructed for why human beings need strong government, and remains equally controversial for the conclusions it reaches about what that government is permitted to do in the name of that necessity. He was not a comfortable philosopher. His contemporaries found him dangerous, his conclusions offensive, his materialism scandalous, and his dismissal of religious authority somewhere between provocative and blasphemous. Royalists suspected him because he derived royal authority from human contract rather than divine right, which meant that a sufficiently powerful usurper had the same claim to obedience as a legitimate king, provided only that the usurper could actually maintain order. Parliamentarians despised him because he argued for absolute sovereign power and regarded the parliamentary cause, the cause that had, in their understanding, rescued England from tyranny, as a species of philosophical confusion that led inexorably to civil war. The Church regarded him with horror because he reduced religion to a political institution and proposed to subordinate it entirely to the decisions of the civil sovereign. The universities banned his books. Parliament came close to prosecuting him for heresy. He spent the last decades of his life under a cloud of official suspicion that never fully lifted. And yet the power of his arguments could not be simply dismissed, because they were built with a precision and a logical force that demanded engagement, even from those who found his conclusions intolerable, even from those who found him personally objectionable, even from those whose professional and spiritual interests required them to prove him wrong. What Hobbes created was not merely a political philosophy, but a complete account of the human condition, an account rooted in the most unflattering and most honest assessment of human motivation that Western philosophy had produced up to that point. He looked at human beings and saw not the rational animals of Aristotle, not the image of God creatures of Christian theology, not the naturally sociable citizens of classical political thought who flourished in community and withered in isolation, but creatures driven fundamentally by fear, by appetite, by the ceaseless, restless, competitive striving for power that is, in his account, simply what human psychology is. Not a defect, not a moral failing, not a corruption of an originally better nature, simply what the design of the universe has produced in the particular kind of animal that we are. And from this bleak and honest starting point, he derived with extraordinary logical care the institutions and the reasoning that he believed were necessary to make civilized life possible at all. Not because civilized life was natural, not because human beings were designed for it, but because the alternative was so catastrophically bad that rational creatures, fully understanding what that alternative was, would accept almost any terms to escape it. His biography is inseparable from his philosophy in ways that repay careful and extended attention. He was born in 1588. By his own account, his mother delivered him prematurely when she heard of the approach of the Spanish Armada, so that he and fear were, in a sense, born together as twins. Whether or not this story is literally true, it is metaphysically perfect for the philosopher it describes. Fear is the master concept of his entire philosophical system, the central emotional and psychological fact around which he built his account of human nature, political authority, and the foundations of law. A philosopher who made fear into a technical term, into a philosophical engine capable of doing the heaviest theoretical work, who derived the necessity of sovereign power from the universal and rational fear that human beings have of violent death. This philosopher was born, he liked to say, alongside fear, and the two of them never parted company. He carried fear with him through 91 years of a life that included exile, censorship, the threat of prosecution, and the watching of his country tear itself apart. He never stopped thinking that the fear of violent death was the most philosophically important and most practically significant fact about human beings. His life unfolded across one of the most catastrophically eventful periods in English history, and the catastrophes were not background events that happened to other people while he sat safely in his study. They were immediate, pressing, and personally threatening. He fled his country to avoid arrest. He watched from Paris as the institutions of English political life were destroyed by the forces he had spent his career warning against. He lived long enough to see those institutions rebuilt in forms that his own theory had helped to explain, if not to justify. And he went on writing, going on arguing, and provoking the established authorities of his age, the church, the universities, the philosophers who held positions he considered philosophically indefensible, until he was literally too old to hold a pen. He was, by every account, a man of extraordinary intellectual confidence, enormous personal courage of a specific and unusual kind, and complete imperviousness to the social pressures that would have silenced a less philosophically committed person decades earlier. What you are about to encounter is a philosophy of radical realism and radical order that refuses every comfortable illusion about human nature, political authority, and the foundations of social life. It is not a reassuring philosophy. It was never meant to be. It is a philosophy that takes seriously a question most political thinkers find too disturbing to pursue without flinching. What would human life actually be like without the institutions that currently organize it? And what does the honest answer to that question tell us about what those institutions must be, and what price we should be willing to pay for them? Hobbes answered that question with a systematic rigor that his contemporaries found terrifying, and that continues, in every era of political instability, to sound startlingly and uncomfortably relevant. The philosophy of Hobbes is not something you read and then set aside. It is something you read and then find yourself unable to stop applying, unable to stop asking the questions it plants in you, unable to observe any political situation, any civil conflict, any collapse of institutional authority, any failed state, any moment when the thin membrane separating civilization from chaos becomes suddenly and visibly fragile, without wondering whether Hobbes was right. Unable to look at the comfortable arrangements of your own political life without wondering which of them are genuinely stable and which are performances you have been giving so long, in a society that has been performing them so consistently that you have forgotten they are performances sustained by specific historical conditions that are not guaranteed to continue indefinitely. That is what genuine philosophy does. That is what Hobbes was doing. And that is what we are going to explore. Part 1. The foundation, war, exile, and the birth of a philosopher. Philosophy often begins in comfort and leisure, in the academies and studies of the prosperous and the protected. Hobbes's philosophy began in something closer to catastrophe and displacement. Understanding where he started, the specific historical experience that formed the living context of his thought, is essential for understanding what he built from it, because his philosophy was not invented in safety. It was extracted from the experience of watching a political order come apart at the seams, forged in the prolonged crisis of civil war and religious conflict, and tested against the reality of what actually happens when the structures of political authority cease to function and the people who should be maintaining them are too busy fighting each other over the principles that should govern that maintenance to actually do it. He was born on April 5th, 1588, in Westport, near Malmesbury in Wiltshire, the son of a disgraced vicar who abandoned his family after a brawl at a church door and disappeared from Thomas's life before the boy was old enough to form a clear memory of him. The abandonment was not metaphorically significant. Hobbes never presented it as the source of his political philosophy. But it is worth noting that the philosopher who would argue most powerfully for the necessity of reliable authority was formed from the beginning in conditions where one of the most fundamental authorities in a child's life had simply absconded. His upbringing was taken over by his uncle Francis, a glovemaker of sufficient means to provide Thomas with a decent education, first at local schools in Malmesbury and then, at the age of 14, at Magdalen Hall, Oxford. He was a precocious student, genuinely gifted, and almost entirely bored by the scholastic philosophy that Oxford taught. The old Aristotelian framework, the elaborate disputation about medieval categories, the philosophical vocabulary that seemed to him designed for impressive display rather than the discovery of truth. He found the textbooks dreary and spent considerable time in the university's library reading maps and other things he actually found interesting. He graduated in 1608 without apparent distinction, in the terms Oxford measured distinction, and secured employment as a tutor to the son of William Cavendish, Earl of Devonshire. This position with the Cavendish family was not merely a biographical convenience or a means of paying his bills. It was the institutional foundation of his intellectual life for the next several decades, and it gave him things that no university appointment of the period could have provided. It gave him access to one of the great private libraries of England, in which he could read whatever he chose without the supervision of a faculty that would have found many of his interests questionable. It gave him the opportunity to accompany his pupil on continental tours, extended journeys through France, Italy, and other parts of Europe that brought him into contact with the most advanced scientific and philosophical thinking of the age. It gave him proximity to the aristocratic and political culture of early Stuart England, including the conversations, the court gossip, the political anxieties, and the constitutional tensions that were already, by the 1620s, building toward the catastrophe that would eventually produce the Civil War. And it gave him, perhaps most importantly, the social position and financial security to think, rather than merely to earn, to develop ideas over decades, rather than to produce the rapid journeyman scholarship that would have been required of a working academic. Through the Cavendish connection, he met Francis Bacon, who was then at the height of his influence, and whose vision of a reformed, empirically grounded natural philosophy deeply influenced Hobbes's understanding of what philosophy should aspire to do. He travelled to the continent and met the scientists and mathematicians who were remaking the understanding of the physical world, including Galileo, with whom he had at least one direct conversation in Florence during a visit in 1636. He corresponded with Marin Mersenne, the Parisian friar who served as the central node in the network of European natural philosophers, through whom he engaged with René Descartes and the entire developing tradition of mechanistic philosophy. He was not simply observing the scientific revolution from a respectful distance. He was a participant in it, engaged with its central figures, thinking through its implications with the same intensity and the same commitment to radical consistency that he brought to everything else. Meanwhile, England was deteriorating. The conflict between King Charles I and Parliament over the constitutional basis of royal authority, over taxation, over the prerogative courts, over the king's relationship to parliamentary oversight, was moving, through the 1620s and 1630s, from constitutional disagreement to constitutional crisis. Hobbes watched this deterioration with the attention of a man who had been thinking for years about the philosophical foundations of political authority, and who could see, with the horrible clarity that theoretical understanding sometimes provides, exactly where the escalating conflict was heading. He saw in Archies the constitutional arguments of the parliamentary side a philosophical error that was producing a political catastrophe, the error of positing rights and authorities that competed with and constrained the sovereign, creating precisely the situation of divided authority that his emerging theory identified as the generative cause of civil war. In 1640, as the crisis moved toward its breaking point, and Parliament was beginning to assert its authority in ways that made the position of those associated with the royalist cause acutely uncomfortable, Hobbes fled to France. He later described himself as the first of all who fled, and this is probably an exaggeration, but not a false one. He was frightened. He said so. He thought he was in genuine danger, and his response to fear, rational, immediate, unsentimental, was to remove himself from the source of the threat with as little delay as possible. This is worth dwelling on precisely because it seems at odds with the conventional image of the courageous philosopher who says difficult things regardless of the consequences. Hobbes was not that kind of courageous. He said difficult things, but he was deeply and consistently unwilling to pay the price that would have been required to say them in circumstances where saying them was physically dangerous. He fled. And this flight, rather than being a mark against his philosophy, is entirely consistent with it. The man who believed that the rational response to the threat of violent death was to accept almost any terms to avoid it, was when faced with a genuine threat of violent death, rationally prepared to accept almost any terms, including exile from his country, to avoid it. In Paris, he found an intellectual environment of extraordinary richness and productivity. He completed the Elements of Law, which he had been working on in England, and which circulated in manuscript before the Civil War began. He wrote De Cive, which presented the essential political philosophy that would later become Leviathan in a more concentrated and more explicitly argumentative form. He engaged with Descartes through Mersenn's network, producing objections to the Meditations that constitute one of the most philosophically interesting exchanges in the history of philosophy. He tutored the future King Charles II in mathematics. He thought, worked, wrote, argued, and refined the ideas that would eventually produce the masterwork. And in 1651, he published Leviathan, the book that would define his legacy and unsettle his age and generate controversy that has not entirely subsided in the more than 3.5 centuries since its first appearance. The publication of Leviathan managed, with remarkable efficiency, to offend virtually everyone simultaneously. The royalists at court in exile were furious because the book derived the authority of sovereigns from human contract and calculation rather than from divine right, which meant that a de facto sovereign, the Commonwealth government that had executed the king and was currently governing England, had as much claim to the obedience of subjects as any legitimate monarchy, provided only that it was actually capable of maintaining order. This was not the philosophical support for the restoration of the Stuart monarchy that the royalists had been hoping for. The parliamentary and Puritan factions in England were disturbed by the book's insistence on absolute sovereign authority and its explicit subordination of religious claims to civil authority. The Catholic Church was horrified by its systematic effort to demonstrate that the claims of the Church to any authority, independent of civil sovereignty, were philosophically incoherent. It was, in short, a book that had something deeply offensive for everyone, and its author returned to England shortly after its publication to make what peace he could with the Commonwealth government, which was, his own theory told him, the legitimate sovereign of the moment, and to which he was therefore obligated to submit. The transformation he had undergone, or that history had performed on him, was this. He had started as a man of conventional education and conventional social position, attached to the aristocratic world of early Stuart England, and had ended as the author of the most radical, secular account of political authority in the history of Western thought. What drove the transformation was not personal suffering in any simple sense. He was never poor, never physically abused by the political chaos he observed, never imprisoned. What drove it was the experience of watching, from a position of sufficient education and sufficient theoretical sophistication to understand what he was seeing, a political order, dissolve. He saw the Civil War not merely as a catastrophe but as a philosophical problem, a problem that had philosophical causes and that required philosophical solutions. And he spent the better part of his life working out what those solutions were. Part 2. The intellectual formation, Euclid, Galileo, and the geometry of politics. To understand Hobbes's philosophy, you must understand his method, and his method was unlike anything that had characterized political philosophy before him. He did not proceed by interpreting scripture, by cataloguing historical precedents, by appealing to the authority of Aristotle or the Church Fathers or the accumulated wisdom of generations of jurists. He did not proceed by the kind of practical wisdom that Aristotle had identified as the characteristic virtue of the experienced statesman. He proceeded by geometric demonstration, by the same method that Euclid had used to derive the entire structure of geometry from a small set of axioms and definitions, building up a system of certain knowledge through clear definition and deductive reasoning from first principles. This was not a stylistic preference or a rhetorical choice. It was a philosophical position, and it was a position that changed everything about what political philosophy could aspire to do and what it could claim to have demonstrated. The decisive intellectual encounter that shaped this methodological commitment came relatively late in his development, sometime in the late 1620s or early 1630s, when he was already in his 40s. The story, which he himself told in various forms, involves opening a copy of Euclid's Elements and happening to read the 47th proposition, the Pythagorean theorem. His first reaction, according to the story, was that the proposition was impossible. It seemed too strong, too definitive, too certain to be true. Then he read the proof. The proof worked by showing that the conclusion followed necessarily from earlier propositions in the text, which themselves followed from still earlier ones, all the way back to the fundamental definitions and axioms at the beginning. The conclusion was inescapable, not because an authority had asserted it, not because tradition had accepted it, not because common sense found it intuitively plausible, but because the logic of the argument left no alternative. If you accepted the starting points, you had to accept the conclusion. The demonstration was airtight. This experience struck him with the force of a revelation, and the reason it struck him with such force is important to understand. He was, at the time, living in a world in which every significant political and theological question was the subject of endless, apparently irresolvable dispute. Parliament disputed with the king about the constitutional basis of taxation. Puritans disputed with Anglicans about the proper form of religious worship. Catholics disputed with Protestants about the authority of the Pope and the interpretation of Scripture. Philosophers disputed with one another about the foundations of knowledge, the nature of virtue, and the proper organization of the Commonwealth. These disputes had been going on for decades, for generations, in some cases for centuries, and they showed no signs of resolution. What Euclid had demonstrated was that there was another way, a method that could produce certainty rather than mere plausibility, that could resolve disputes by showing that one side was wrong rather than merely less persuasive than the other, that could build a system of knowledge so solid that no rational person who had followed the argument could coherently deny its conclusions. He immediately saw the political application. If the disputes that were tearing England apart were, at their root, disputes about philosophical first principles, about what political authority was, where it came from, what its limits were, what obligations it created, then those disputes could in principle be resolved by the same method that had resolved the disputes of geometry. Start with agreed definitions of the relevant terms. Reason from those definitions with geometric rigor. Show what follows necessarily from the agreed starting points. The conclusions would then be not merely persuasive, but demonstrably necessary. Things that any rational person who accepted the starting points had to accept, in the same way that any rational person who accepted Euclid's axioms had to accept the 47th proposition. This was an extraordinarily ambitious program, and it was also, as his critics at the time and ever since have pointed out, based on a significant overestimate of the certainty that philosophical argument could achieve. The problem was that while the axioms of geometry are accepted by everyone who understands them, they are, as nearly as anything can be, self-evident to reason. The first principles of political philosophy are not. What human nature is, what the state of nature would be like, what rational people would agree to, what political authority is for, these are questions on which intelligent, serious, carefully reasoning people disagree. And the disagreement is not resolved simply by demanding greater rigor, because the disagreement is at the level of the starting points themselves. Hobbes's critics could and did dispute his premises. And once you dispute the premises, the deductive structure built on them cannot deliver certainty, regardless of how carefully it is constructed. But the ambition, even in its imperfection, was philosophically transformative. It forced onto political philosophy a standard of rigor and explicitness that it had never previously had to meet. It required clear definitions rather than the vague and contested vocabulary that previous political philosophers had traded in. It insisted that assumptions be stated rather than smuggled in through rhetorical convention. It demanded that the argument proceed step by step rather than leap from attractive premises to convenient conclusions by way of plausible-sounding rhetoric. And it made the structure of the argument visible and therefore criticizable in ways that the more diffuse reasoning of previous political philosophers had not been. Even those who disagreed with Hobbes knew precisely what they were disagreeing with and why, which was itself a significant philosophical advance. The scientific revolution was not merely a backdrop to his intellectual development. It was one of its central inputs, and the relationship between his political philosophy and the new mechanistic physics of the 17th century is not metaphorical, but structural. He met Galileo in Florence in 1636, and the encounter appears to have been genuinely significant. Galileo had demonstrated that the physical world could be understood as a system of bodies in motion, governed by mathematical laws that could be discovered through observation and demonstrated through geometric proof. The Galilean universe was a universe that could be understood, rigorously, certainly, completely, without reference to the kind of teleological or theological categories that had dominated natural philosophy since Aristotle. Things moved the way they moved because of their physical properties and the forces acting on them, not because of the purposes God had designed them to serve. Hobbes generalized this insight into a comprehensive philosophical commitment that he called materialism. Everything in the universe, including human beings and their mental and emotional lives, was matter in motion. There were no immaterial substances, no souls existing independently of bodies, no spiritual forces acting on the physical world from outside it. Everything that existed was the body, and everything that happened was the motion of bodies. This was a position of staggering philosophical ambition and staggering theological danger, and Hobbes embraced it with the same cheerful indifference to the social consequences of his views that characterized his political philosophy. He was not trying to be scandalous. He was trying to be true. The materialist commitment had immediate and far-reaching consequences for his political philosophy because it determined the kind of account of human nature that was available to him. If human beings are material systems, complex, elaborate, extraordinarily sophisticated material systems, but material systems nonetheless, then their desires and fears and calculations are not the operations of an immaterial soul that might aspire to transcend the constraints of physical nature. They are physical processes operating according to the same mechanical laws that govern everything else. And this means that a science of human behavior becomes possible in principle. A science that derives from the properties of material systems, reliable predictions about how human beings will consistently behave in specified circumstances. And from those predictions derives the political arrangements that are required to make human life stable and productive. Part 3. Human Nature, the Engine of Fear and Appetite. Before Hobbes could build his political philosophy, he had to build his account of human nature, because the political philosophy was explicitly and deliberately designed to follow from human nature as a conclusion follows from its premises. Every feature of his politics, the state of nature, the social contract, the nature and extent of sovereign authority, was supposed to be derivable from an accurate account of what kind of creatures human beings are. And his account of human nature was, by the standards of his time and arguably by the standards of any time, shockingly reductive, shockingly honest, and shockingly accurate in ways that made it impossible for serious people to dismiss, even for those who most desperately wanted to dismiss it. Human beings, in his account, are in the first instance desiring machines. They move toward things they desire and away from things they fear, and this movement, this perpetual, restless, never-completed cycle of appetite and aversion, of pursuit and avoidance, is simply what life is. To be alive is to desire. To cease desiring is to die. This is not a metaphor and not a moral judgment. It is a description of what the human organism does, stated as flatly and as precisely as possible. The good, in his technical philosophical sense, is not some objective property that things have independently of human psychology. The good is simply what is desired. The bad is simply what is feared or avoided. There is no other source of value, no Platonic form of the good visible to reason, no divine command that establishes value independently of the desires and aversions of actual human beings. Value is internal to psychology and nothing more. This position, which philosophers call subjectivism about value, was not philosophically original to Hobbes, but he deployed it with a precision and a political purpose that gave it a new kind of power. The entire tradition of natural law philosophy, the idea that there are objective moral truths that human reason can discover independently of what any particular person or culture happens to desire, truths that are binding on everyone regardless of their preferences, is swept away by this single observation, or rather by the evidence behind it, that people disagree persistently and irresolvably about what is genuinely good. If the good were an objective property that reason could discover, you would expect the conclusions of careful reasoners to converge, the way the conclusions of careful geometers converge on the same theorems. Instead, what you observe is that every careful reasoner reaches conclusions that happen to be remarkably convenient for the reasoner's own interests, and remarkably inconvenient for the interests of those the reasoner is arguing against. The natural law, it turns out, always seems to require exactly what the person invoking it happens to want. This is not a coincidence. It is a symptom of the fact that the natural law is not a real thing that reason discovers, but a rhetorical device that interested parties deploy. The second major element of his account of human nature is what he calls the restlessness of desire. The observation that human wants are not only insatiable individually, but structured in a way that makes their satisfaction impossible collectively. Human beings do not desire a fixed quantity of pleasure, or security or power that they could in principle achieve and then rest content with. They desire more, always more, and crucially their assessment of how much they have is always made by comparison with others. The satisfaction of a desire does not eliminate the desire. It raises the baseline against which the next satisfaction is measured. The person who has achieved a certain level of wealth and security is not satisfied. They compare themselves to those who have more, and the comparison generates new dissatisfaction and new striving. This comparative structure of desire means that competition is not an occasional feature of human social life, not something that arises from exceptional circumstances or from moral failure. It is the permanent and structurally necessary condition of a species whose fundamental drives have the form Hobbes describes. He extends this account into an explicit theory of the universal human drive for power. Power, in his definition, is simply the present means to obtain some future apparent good. This definition is much broader than the ordinary political sense of the word. Power includes not just political authority or physical force, but money, social reputation, knowledge, friends, anything that gives a person the ability to obtain what they want. And the drive for power, the drive to accumulate the means to get what you want, is, in his account, universal and unceasing. Not because human beings are especially wicked or especially ambitious, but because anyone who does not continuously strive to maintain or increase their power will find that those who do are getting more of what they want at the expense of those who are not. The competitive structure of human desire makes the accumulation of power a matter not of greed, but of rational self-preservation. The third crucial element is what he calls the equality of human beings in the relevant political sense. And this equality is one of the most philosophically important and most empirically arresting features of his account. He does not mean that people are equal in talent, in strength, in intelligence, or in beauty. He means that people are approximately equal in their capacity to kill one another, and this approximate equality in the capacity for lethal violence is philosophically decisive. Even the weakest, the least intelligent, the most physically disadvantaged person can kill the strongest and most capable, given sufficient cunning, given the element of surprise, given a tool or a weapon, given the willingness to act, when the more powerful person is sleeping or incapacitated or simply inattentive. This approximate equality in lethal capacity means that no one in the state of nature can achieve genuine security through individual power. No one is so strong that they can afford to ignore the possibility of being killed by those weaker than themselves. The uncertainty is universal. The vulnerability is universal. And a universal vulnerability means universal fear. His materialism extended all the way down into the most intimate operations of the human mind, and this extension was philosophically necessary for the project of deriving political conclusions from psychological premises. Sense perception, in his account, is produced by the motion of external objects acting on the sense organs, which transmit that motion to the brain, where it produces the experience of sensation. Imagination is decaying sense, the continuation of that motion in the brain after the original stimulus has been removed, growing gradually weaker as it decays. Memory is imagination combined with the recognition that the experience is past. Reasoning is the mental equivalent of arithmetic, the addition and subtraction of concepts, the combination and separation of mental images, according to rules of association and logic. The will is not a mysterious faculty of free choice standing above the causal order of nature. It is the last appetite in a process of deliberation. Whatever desire wins out over competing desires in the moment before action is the will. And that desire wins out because of the specific configuration of prior causes that produced it, not because of some uncaused act of a choosing self. This account of the mind eliminates from the start any basis for the claim that human beings can transcend their natural psychology through the exercise of reason or will. The person who claims to have risen above fear, above appetite, above the competitive drive for power, is either deceiving themselves or performing a social role. The psychology is the person. There is no self underneath the psychology that could do otherwise. This does not make human beings unfree in any sense that matters practically. Hobbes had a careful account of freedom as the absence of external impediment, not as the ability to act against one's own nature. But it does make the political implications of the psychology inescapable. If human beings are what he describes, then the political arrangements appropriate for them must be designed for what they are, not for what moralists wish they were or theologians believe they should aspire to become. Part 4. The State of Nature. What happens without government? The most famous and most philosophically powerful concept in Hobbes's entire system is his account of the state of nature, the condition of human life as it would be, and as it in some situations actually is, in the absence of a common political authority capable of keeping the peace. The state of nature is not, in Hobbes's explicit account, a historical claim about how human beings once lived before the invention of political institutions, though he believed it approximated the actual condition of some peoples he knew of from travellers' accounts of the Americas. It is a philosophical device, a thought experiment, a counterfactual hypothesis, designed to answer a specific and fundamental question. Given what human beings actually are, given the psychology he has described in such precise and unflattering terms, what would their condition be if there were no sovereign power to define property, enforce agreements, and punish violence? The answer he gives is one of the most memorable and most debated passages in the history of political philosophy. In such a condition, he writes, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This enumeration is doing philosophical work that deserves careful unpacking, because it is not simply a list of unpleasant things that are absent from the state of nature. It is a systematic causal account of why the state of nature makes civilized life impossible from the ground up. The reason there is no industry in the state of nature is not that people are too stupid or too lazy to be industrious. Industry is only rational when you can expect to benefit from it, and the state of nature makes that expectation impossible to sustain. Why would you plant crops if you have no assurance that you will be the one who harvests them? Why would you build a house if someone stronger might simply take it from you the moment it is built? Why would you invest any effort in a productive enterprise whose payoff lies in the future if you cannot be confident of surviving until the payoff arrives? The state of nature eliminates not just specific goods, but the very conditions under which rational long-term investment in any productive activity is possible. It eliminates, in other words, civilization at its roots, not merely at its surface. The specific phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, has done more sustained philosophical and rhetorical work than almost any other formulation in the Western tradition. Each of its 5 adjectives is doing specific philosophical labour. Solitary because in the state of nature genuine society, the stable, rule-governed, trust-based cooperation that constitutes real social life, is impossible. What exists instead is temporary and fragile alliances among individuals who know that every other individual is a potential threat, and that any alliance will last only as long as it serves the immediate interests of both parties. Poor, because the productivity that generates material wealth requires exactly the security of expectation that the state of nature destroys. Nasty, a word whose 17th century force was considerably stronger than its current, mildly disapproving meaning, because the conditions of permanent insecurity and potential violent conflict degrade not just material life but the entire texture of human experience, leaving no room for the pleasures, the arts, the relationships that give life its deepest satisfactions. Brutish, because the competition for resources and the ever-present threat of violent death reduces interaction to its most elementary, most animal forms. Not the deliberate cruelty of a villain, but the desperate expedience of creatures operating under maximum pressure with minimal resources and no guarantees. Short, because violent death is not an exceptional catastrophe in the state of nature, but a permanent, always imminent possibility that makes it irrational to plan for a future that may never arrive. He was careful to anticipate the objection that this description is implausible, that it exaggerates human wickedness, that it ignores human sociability, that no actual human beings have ever lived in the condition he describes. His response was one of his most rhetorically brilliant moves. Look at your own behavior within the framework of existing political society and ask yourself what it reveals about your actual opinion of your fellow human beings. When you travel, you carry weapons. When you go to sleep, you lock your doors. You lock your chests against the people who live in your own house. You have lawyers draft your contracts because you do not trust the people you are contracting with to honor their verbal commitments. You support armies, navies, and police forces at enormous expense because you do not trust the other political communities that surround yours to remain peaceful without the deterrent of force. What do all of these behaviors reveal about your actual beliefs about human nature, even in a world in which political authority exists and is functioning? They reveal that you believe, quite correctly, that without the external constraints of law and the threat of punishment, the people around you would behave in ways that would be very bad for you. The state of nature is not a fantasy about how wicked people might behave. It is the condition that your own daily precautions reveal you to believe would exist if the precautions were removed. He also pointed to the most obvious actual approximation of the state of nature available to any observer of his time: the relations among sovereign states. The kingdoms and principalities of Europe had no common sovereign above them to enforce agreements and punish aggression. They lived in relation to one another in exactly the condition Hobbes described, maintaining armies, building fortifications, treating every other state as a potential enemy, breaking agreements whenever breaking them was advantageous, making war whenever war served their interests. The difference between the state of nature and international relations in the 17th century was not structural, but merely a matter of degree. And this observation, far from being a pessimistic fantasy, was simply a description of the most visible and undeniable feature of the political world that anyone with eyes could observe. The state of nature carries within it one further philosophical point that is easy to overlook, but that matters enormously for everything that follows. In the state of nature, there is no justice. Justice, in Hobbes's account, is the performance of covenants, the honouring of agreements that have been made. But covenants are only binding when there is an authority capable of enforcing them, because a rational person who knows that the other party to an agreement can break it with impunity has no rational basis for keeping their own side of the bargain. Without enforcement, covenants are words, and the state of nature is a place where words are cheap and swords expensive. If there is no enforcement of agreements, there is no property, because property is simply the right to possess something backed by the agreement of the community and the enforcement power of the sovereign. If there is no property, there is no distinction between mine and thine, and therefore no concept of taking what belongs to someone else, and therefore no concept of injustice. In the state of nature, injustice is not a common occurrence. It is a conceptual impossibility. Justice does not exist there to be violated. Part 5. The social contract. Fear as the foundation of legitimate authority. If the state of nature is the catastrophe Hobbes describes, and he argued with considerable force and considerable evidence that it is, then rational human beings have the most powerful, possible motive to escape it. The question is what escaping it requires, and what the terms of the escape tell us about the nature of political authority and the obligations of those who live under it. The answer he provides is the social contract, but the contract he describes is so different in its structure, its purposes, and its implications from what later contract theorists would develop, that the similarity of the name is almost misleading. Hobbes's contract is not about preserving pre-existing natural rights. It is not about creating a government that is accountable to the people who created it. It is not about establishing the conditions for democratic participation or political representation in any meaningful sense. It is about one thing only, the one thing that actually matters to creatures who have honestly confronted what the state of nature is, escaping from it, by whatever means, and at whatever price the escape requires. The fundamental mechanism of the contract is the transfer of right. In the state of nature, every person has what Hobbes calls a right to everything, a right rooted in the fundamental drive for self-preservation, which licenses any action that might contribute to survival. This right to everything sounds like a wonderful thing. In practice, it is the source of the catastrophe, because if everyone has a right to everything, then no one has a secure right to anything. Your right to the field is exactly as strong as my right to the field, and since neither of us has any authority above us to adjudicate between our competing claims, the question of who gets the field is resolved by violence or the threat of violence. The unlimited right of the state of nature is not a treasure, but a poison that makes security impossible. The solution is for each person to agree to transfer their right to everything to a single authority, the sovereign, retaining only the right to self-defense in cases where the sovereign itself threatens their life, since that right is the one right that cannot coherently be transferred. In making this transfer, each person simultaneously enlarges their security, because everyone else has also transferred their right to violence, leaving the sovereign as the only remaining legitimate wielder of force, and diminishes their liberty, because they have given up the right to act on their own judgment in all the matters that the sovereign's law now governs. This trade, security for liberty, the constrained protection of political society for the unconstrained but worthless freedom of the state of nature, is the fundamental bargain of political life, and Hobbes thought it was a good bargain because he had a precise and unflinching understanding of what the alternative actually was. The reasoning behind why rational people would accept this transfer is worth dwelling on carefully, because it is not the reasoning of later contract theorists, and the difference matters enormously. Hobbes's contractors are not making the transfer because they believe the sovereign deserves their loyalty or has earned their trust. They are not making it because they believe the sovereign will govern wisely or justly or in their best interests. They are making it because they have performed a rational calculation that living under even a very bad sovereign is better than living without any sovereign at all. Better than the state of nature, which is the only alternative. This is a remarkably thin basis for political obligation, but it is also a remarkably strong one, because it does not depend on any particular goodness in the sovereign and therefore cannot be revoked, simply because the sovereign fails to live up to the standards of goodness that the subjects would prefer. These obligation derives from the calculation, and the calculation depends only on the state of nature being as bad as Hobbes says it is. If you accept the description of the state of nature, if you accept that the alternative to sovereign authority is the war of all against all, then the obligation to obey almost any functioning sovereign follows with something close to logical necessity. The sovereign that emerges from this contract can take different forms. It can be a single monarch, an aristocratic council, or a democratic assembly. And Hobbes had theoretical arguments for preferring monarchy. He thought it was more decisive, less prone to the factional competition that plagued assemblies, more capable of identifying its own long-term interest with the interest of the state. But his political philosophy did not depend on this preference, and would have survived the preference being wrong. What was essential was not the form of the sovereign, but certain structural features it had to possess. It had to be unified enough to speak and act with a single voice. It had to be capable of making enforceable decisions consistently. And it had to be genuinely sovereign in the sense of being the final authority in the political community, not subject to being overridden by any higher authority within the community. Part 6. The Leviathan. Sovereignty as artificial person. The concept of the Leviathan, the vast artificial person that is the product of the social covenant and that holds all the authority of a commonwealth in its single unified hand, is one of the most original and most philosophically productive ideas in the history of political thought. It is worth examining not just as a political doctrine to be accepted or rejected, but as an exercise in philosophical imagination of the first order, the conception of a genuinely new kind of entity, one that does not exist in nature, one whose properties and obligations and powers cannot be understood by simple analogy with any natural thing, one that is simultaneously the creation of those who are subject to it, and the authority that stands over them with powers they themselves could not individually wield. The famous frontispiece of the first edition of Leviathan is one of the most philosophically precise images in the history of political thought. It shows an enormous figure, the sovereign, the commonwealth, the Leviathan, whose body is made up entirely of the tiny bodies of countless individual human beings, all oriented towards the head, which rises above the landscape of towns and churches over which the figure presides. In one hand, the figure holds a sword, the symbol of civil authority, of the power to make war and punish violations of law. In the other hand, it holds a crozier, the symbol of ecclesiastical authority, of the power to govern religious life and determine the content of publicly accepted religious doctrine. The image encodes Hobbes's complete political theology in visual form. Both civil and religious authority belong to the same artificial person, the Leviathan, which is constituted by and authorized by the natural persons who make up its body. The concept of authorization that underlies this image is philosophically precise and practically important. When you authorize another person to act in your name, when you give someone your power of attorney, for example, or when you elect a representative to vote on your behalf, their actions in the relevant domain become your actions. You cannot coherently complain that your authorized representative has wronged you by doing what they were authorized to do, because you gave them the authority. Hobbes uses this legal concept of authorization to explain the relationship between the sovereign and the subjects with great technical care. The subjects have authorized the sovereign to act in their name. This means, in the precise sense, that the sovereign's laws are the subject's own laws, that when the sovereign commands something, it is doing so as the authorized representative of the subjects who created it, and the subject's complaint that the sovereign's laws are unjust or unreasonable is therefore a form of self-contradiction. They are complaining about their own representative, whom they authorized unconditionally. This is a genuinely disturbing implication, and deserves to be confronted rather than explained away. Hobbes knew it was disturbing. He argued for it anyway, because he thought the alternative, allowing subjects to withdraw their authorization from a sovereign on the basis of their own judgment that the sovereign was governing badly, was the philosophical prescription for civil war. The moment you allow subjects to judge for themselves whether the sovereign's acts are sufficiently good to continue to warrant their obedience, you have created the conditions for endless factional conflict, because different subjects will reach different judgments. Some will decide the sovereign has behaved so badly that rebellion is warranted. Others will decide the sovereign's behavior is acceptable. And you have recreated, within the framework of political society, the very problem that political society was supposed to solve, the situation in which there is no final authority capable of resolving disputes, in which every claim to authority can be challenged by competing claims, in which the resolution of disagreements reverts to violence. The Leviathan has a unity that its constituent natural persons individually lack. Individual human beings are internally conflicted. They have competing desires, ambivalent loyalties, shifting commitments. They can be of two minds about what to do, can be paralyzed by indecision, can change their minds in the middle of an action. The Leviathan, properly constituted, is incapable of these forms of internal division. It speaks with one voice, decides with one will, acts with one purpose. This artificial unity is, in Hobbes's account, the central valuable thing that the social covenant creates. The state of nature is a condition of profound uncertainty about what other people will do, a condition in which every expectation is provisional, and every plan is hostage to the unpredictable decisions of others operating under their own pressures with their own interests. Political society, under a functioning sovereign, is a condition in which certain expectations become reliable. Expectations about what the law prohibits, about what contracts will be enforced, about what kinds of behavior will be punished, and what kinds will be tolerated. This reliability of expectation is the precondition for everything else, for investment, for trade, for friendship, for the arts, for the entire complex productive social life that human beings are capable of when they are not spending all their energy managing the threat of imminent violence. The Leviathan is mortal, as Hobbes acknowledges with characteristic bluntness. It can be destroyed by external conquest, by internal rebellions successfully carried out, by the dissolution of the covenant through the sovereign's inability to provide protection. And when the Leviathan dies, what follows is not some improved form of political life in which the people govern themselves more wisely without the sovereign's interference. What follows is the state of nature. This is a point Hobbes makes with deliberate and unrelenting emphasis, and it is philosophically central rather than merely rhetorical. Every argument for the right of rebellion, every argument for popular sovereignty in the sense of the people's right to overthrow their governors, every argument for constitutional limits on sovereign authority that could justify resistance to the sovereign if the limits were violated, all of these arguments end in his account at the same place: the destruction of the Leviathan and the return to the state of nature. The revolutionaries who celebrate the fall of a sovereign as a liberation are, in this account, celebrating the death of the only thing that stood between their fellow citizens and the war of all against all. Part 7. Liberty and Law, the Strange Freedom of Hobbesian Subjects. One of the most philosophically interesting and most frequently misunderstood aspects of Hobbes's political philosophy is his account of liberty. Interesting because it turns out to be considerably more nuanced and in certain respects more generous than his reputation as the apostle of absolute sovereignty might suggest, and misunderstood because the account is embedded in a framework that is so different from modern liberal assumptions about rights and freedom that it is easy to impose those assumptions on it and miss what it is actually saying. He defines liberty with the characteristic simplicity and precision of a man who has spent a great deal of time thinking about how to define things precisely. Liberty is the absence of external impediments to motion. A person is free to do something to the extent that nothing external to them prevents them from doing it. This is a purely negative definition of liberty. Liberty as the absence of constraint, as the space within which action is possible because it is not blocked. Law is an external impediment to motion. It constrains behavior through the threat of punishment, which functions as a powerful disincentive. Therefore, law and liberty are genuinely in tension. Every law reduces the liberty of those who are subject to it. This is not a paradox to be explained away or a problem to be solved. It is Hobbes's explicit position, stated as clearly as he can state it, and maintained with complete consistency throughout his work. What makes this position philosophically interesting rather than simply alarming is what follows from the precise definition. If liberty is the absence of external impediments, and if law is the set of external impediments created by sovereign authority, then everywhere the law is silent. Everywhere the sovereign has chosen not to constrain behaviour, the subject is completely free. Not merely permitted, not merely tolerated, but genuinely and fully free, in a way that cannot be overridden by the sovereign's unspoken displeasure or implicit preferences or general desire for conformity. The subject is free to do whatever the law does not prohibit, and this space of freedom, the silence of the law, is not a residual concession grudgingly left over after the important constraints have been imposed. It is a genuine and protected domain of individual liberty that the sovereign has no right to invade without making new law. This has important practical implications. A sovereign who punishes a subject for doing something the law does not prohibit is acting without legal authority. The subject who does something legal is not merely behaving well enough to be tolerated. They are exercising a genuine liberty that the sovereign's authority does not reach. This is a much stronger protection of individual freedom than it might initially appear, especially in the 17th century context, where the arbitrary exercise of royal prerogative, the punishment of subjects for behaviour the sovereign found objectionable, even when it violated no clearly articulated law, was one of the major grievances driving the constitutional conflict. Hobbes's position that legitimate sovereign authority extends only as far as the law it has actually made, and no further, is a real constraint on sovereign power, even within the framework of absolute sovereignty. He goes further, identifying a class of things that subjects cannot be obligated to do regardless of sovereign command, not because these things are protected by natural rights that constrain the sovereign, but because the logical structure of obligation itself makes it impossible to covenant away certain capacities. You cannot make a binding covenant to kill yourself, because the entire point of making covenants was to protect your life. The covenant that requires your death is self-undermining at its root. The reason you entered into the covenant at all was to preserve your existence, and a covenant that ends your existence therefore cancels the reason for the covenant's being binding. The same logic applies to covenants that require you to submit without resistance to execution, to confess to crimes that will result in your death, to surrender to an enemy who will kill you. These things cannot bind you not because you have rights against the sovereign, but because the foundation of all your obligations has been removed by the thing the obligation requires. The relationship between liberty and security that emerges from this analysis is one of Hobbes's most important and most frequently misread contributions to political philosophy. The standard contemporary framing treats liberty and security as values in genuine and inevitable tension, such that any increase in security requires a corresponding sacrifice of liberty and vice versa. This framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that the Hobbesian analysis corrects. In the state of nature, you have maximal, formal liberty. There is no law, no sovereign, no external impediment beyond the physical capacity of others to stop you, and minimal, actual freedom, because the perpetual threat of violence makes it impossible to do most of the things that make liberty valuable. The farmer cannot farm. The merchant cannot trade. The philosopher cannot philosophize. The absolute formal liberty of the state of nature is, in practical terms, worth less than almost any constrained liberty within political society, because the activities that give liberty its value require security as their precondition. Political authority does not simply exchange liberty for security at a fixed rate. It transforms the character of liberty from something formally unlimited but practically worthless, into something formally constrained but practically substantial. The subject who has given up the right to do whatever they want, but who can now actually plan, invest, work, trade, and form lasting relationships in an environment where the security of those activities is maintained by law, has more meaningful freedom than the person who retained formal, unlimited right, but could exercise none of it in practice. This is not a rhetorical trick. It is an insight about the relationship between formal freedom and effective freedom that has profound implications for how we should think about the trade-offs of political life. Part 8. Religion and the Church. Sovereign power over the sacred. Perhaps no aspect of Hobbes's philosophy generated more immediate scandal, more sustained opposition, and more determined institutional hostility than his treatment of religion and religious authority. In an age when religious questions were not merely personal and private matters, but the most explosive forces in political life, when civil wars were being fought over theological positions, when the competing claims of Protestant and Catholic churches to the loyalty of subjects were tearing European states apart, when the question of what God required was simultaneously the most personal and the most politically urgent question that any public figure could be asked, Hobbes applied to the entire apparatus of religious authority the same remorseless secular analysis that he applied to everything else. And the conclusions he reached were, from almost every theological perspective available in the 17th century, devastating. His analysis begins from an epistemological observation that sounds modest but has radical implications. The claims that religious authorities make, claims about the nature of God, the content of divine commands, the authority of Scripture, the validity of miracles, the reliability of prophets and revelations, are all claims about things that cannot be verified by the natural faculties of human reason and experience. We cannot directly observe God. We cannot independently confirm that any given text was divinely inspired rather than humanly composed. We cannot verify that any given person's account of a divine revelation is accurate rather than self-deceptive or deliberately fraudulent. The believer may have excellent personal reasons for finding certain religious claims convincing, but those reasons cannot generate the kind of public, intersubjective certainty that would entitle religious claims to override the decisions of civil authority in the ordering of political life. This epistemological point carries an enormous political consequence. If religious claims cannot be publicly verified, then every political community that contains multiple religious factions, which is to say, every political community in the real world, will contain groups making incompatible and unverifiable claims about what God requires. If those claims are allowed to compete as independent sources of political authority, if the Catholic priest can tell his parishioners that God commands them to disobey the Protestant king, and if this command has genuine binding force, then the political community contains within itself a permanent source of division that no political arrangement can permanently resolve. The solution, for Hobbes, is both obvious and deeply offensive to religious sensibility. The authority to determine, for political purposes, what counts as valid religious doctrine must belong to the civil sovereign. He is careful to distinguish between the inner conviction of belief, which no sovereign can command or prohibit, and the outward profession of religious doctrine in public life, which the sovereign can and must regulate in the interest of social peace. No sovereign can make you believe something you don't believe, but sovereigns can and legitimately do regulate what religious doctrines may be publicly taught, what forms of religious worship are permitted, what religious organizations may operate within their territory and on what terms. These regulations are not violations of religious liberty properly understood. They are the exercise of the sovereign's fundamental responsibility to maintain the conditions under which social life is possible, and social life in the 17th century was demonstrably impossible under conditions of unregulated religious competition. The practical targets of this argument were multiple, and the offence it caused was correspondingly widespread. The Catholic Church's claim to an authority over rulers that derived from God rather than from the civil sovereign, a claim that had been a source of political conflict throughout the medieval period and remained live in the 17th century, was directly and explicitly denied. The Calvinist and Puritan claim that church elders had an independent authority over the conscience of subjects, an authority that could override civil commands when civil commands violated divine law, equally denied. The claim of any religious body to an authority over political life that did not derive from and was not subject to civil sovereign authority, denied across the board and on principle, not as a pragmatic compromise but as a philosophical necessity. His treatment of specific religious doctrines was equally controversial. His account of the nature of the soul, consistent with his materialism, deeply inconsistent with orthodox Christian theology, reduced it to a function of the living body rather than an immortal, immaterial substance. His account of the afterlife was carefully hedged, acknowledging that Scripture seemed to promise it, while suggesting that its nature was quite different from what theological tradition had assumed. His account of the power of the Church to excommunicate, to grant absolution, to perform sacraments, was reduced to a series of symbolic acts that had whatever civil consequence the sovereign authorized, and no consequence beyond that. His treatment of miracles was skeptical without being explicitly dismissive. He noted that the definition of a miracle required knowing the limits of what nature could produce, and that our knowledge of those limits was imperfect. Whether Hobbes was himself a sincere Christian believer is a question that was contested in his own lifetime and has been debated by scholars ever since. He never explicitly denied the existence of God. He professed Christian belief. He argued for the truth of biblical revelation in specific respects. But his philosophical framework made it impossible for religious claims to play the role they played in orthodox theology, and many of his contemporaries concluded that his professions of faith were a protective camouflage deployed by a thoroughgoing atheist or materialist who knew that explicit atheism would be dangerous. Whether this reading is correct or not, it captures something important about the structural relationship between his philosophical commitments and orthodox Christian theology. They were genuinely incompatible, and the incompatibility was not an accidental feature of his specific positions, but a consequence of his most fundamental philosophical commitments. Part 9. The Method of Reading Nature. Hobbes. Among the scientists. Hobbes understood himself to be doing something that had not been done before in the history of political philosophy, bringing to the study of politics and human nature the same rigorous methods that the new natural science was applying to the study of the physical world, and deriving from the application of those methods the same kind of certain, demonstrable knowledge that Galileo and his successors were deriving about the motions of bodies and the structure of the physical universe. This self-understanding is not merely biographical context. It determines the specific form that his political philosophy takes and explains features of it that would otherwise seem puzzling. The scientific revolution of the 17th century was, at its philosophical core, a revolution in method as much as in results. What Galileo and his contemporaries demonstrated was not just that the Earth moved around the Sun, or that, falling, bodies accelerated at a constant rate, though these discoveries were important enough. What they demonstrated was that the physical world could be understood through a specific combination of careful observation, mathematical description, and experimental test that was fundamentally different from the method of the ancient and medieval natural philosophers. The Aristotelian approach to natural philosophy, the classification of natural things by their essential properties, the derivation of their behavior from their natures understood in teleological terms, the appeal to the purposes that God or nature had designed them to serve, was replaced by a method that described the physical world in purely mathematical terms, in terms of the quantitative properties of bodies and the quantitative relationships between those properties. Hobbes was an enthusiastic participant in this methodological revolution, and his materialism, the commitment to the view that everything is body and everything that happens is the motion of bodies, was his way of extending the mechanistic framework of the new physics to the full range of natural phenomena, including the phenomena of human, mental, and social life. If the physical world is nothing but matter in motion, and if human beings are part of the physical world, then human beings are also nothing but matter in motion. Their sensations, their desires, their fears, their reasoning, their social behavior, all of these are physical processes operating according to the same mechanical principles that govern the behavior of everything else. A science of human behavior becomes possible in principle, built on the same foundations as the science of physical behavior and delivering the same kind of certain mathematical, demonstrable results. His engagement with Galileo, whom he visited in Florence in 1636, appears to have been a significant intellectual event, though the details of what passed between them are not fully documented. What is clear is that Galileo's demonstration of the power of mathematical method applied to physical phenomena served as a model and an inspiration for what Hobbes was attempting to do in the domain of politics. If you could derive the laws of motion from first principles about the properties of bodies and the nature of motion, and if those laws then allowed you to predict with precision how physical bodies would behave in specific circumstances, then perhaps you could derive the laws of political life from first principles about human nature and use those laws to predict and design how political institutions would function in specific circumstances. His engagement with Descartes was more contentious and philosophically more productive for both of them, even when, perhaps especially when, they disagreed most sharply. They shared the commitment to mathematical method, the rejection of Aristotelian natural philosophy, and the ambition to reconstruct human knowledge on new and more secure foundations. They disagreed, fundamentally and irreconcilably, on the nature of mind. Descartes had argued that the thinking self, the cogito, the thing that thinks, was a substance genuinely distinct from the extended substance of the physical world, and that this distinctness established the immateriality of the soul, the freedom of the will, and the basis for a kind of knowledge that was not reducible to knowledge of physical processes. Hobbes rejected all of this with characteristic bluntness. There was no immaterial thinking substance. Thought was motion in the brain. The cogito established that something was thinking, not that the thing doing the thinking was immaterial. Descartes' famous proof of the immateriality of the mind was simply a philosophical error, a leap from the undeniable fact that thought was occurring to the completely unwarranted conclusion that the thought was being done by something outside the physical world. The stakes of this disagreement extended far beyond the technical question of whether minds were material or immaterial. If Descartes was right, then human beings had a nature that transcended the purely mechanical operations of the physical world, and the account of human psychology that Hobbes was building had a fundamental gap in it, the gap where free will lived. If Hobbes was right, then the account was complete. Human beings were what their physical constitution made them, driven by the mechanical operations of desire and fear, capable of calculating means to ends, but not of genuinely choosing their ends, fully explicable in principle by the same methods that explained the behavior of everything else in the physical world. The political implications were enormous, because a world in which human nature was what Hobbes said required political institutions designed for that nature, not for a nature that could, through the proper exercise of reason and will, transcend its material determination. His materialism also drove his specific account of language and meaning, which had important philosophical consequences for his political philosophy. Words in his account are not windows onto a realm of timeless meanings or abstract concepts. They are sounds that human beings have agreed to use in certain ways, for certain purposes, in certain contexts. The meaning of a word is its use, the place it occupies in the practices of the community that speaks the language. There are no word-independent meanings, no Platonic forms that words name, no natural categories that language cuts along. This nominalism, the view that general terms are names rather than names of real things, meant that all the grand abstractions of political discourse, justice, rights, the common good, natural law, were not descriptions of real features of the world, but names that different parties in political disputes deployed to dress up their interests in the costume of principle. The question of what justice required was not a question with an answer that reason could discover. It was a question whose answer was determined by whoever had the authority to define the term in the relevant context. And that, in a well-ordered political community, was the sovereign. Part 10. The Critics. What Hobbes got wrong. No serious engagement with Hobbes can afford to avoid the serious criticisms his philosophy has attracted, because those criticisms are serious, because they have been made by some of the most careful philosophers in the tradition, and because engaging with them is the best way to understand both the power and the limits of his achievement. He was not infallible. The arguments he built with such geometric confidence have real gaps, real false premises, real conclusions that he reached by insufficiently examining his starting points. Acknowledging this does not diminish the importance of what he accomplished. It makes the accomplishment clearer by revealing exactly what it was and was not. The most fundamental criticism targets his description of the state of nature, which is the load-bearing foundation on which everything else is built. If the state of nature is not the catastrophic condition he describes, if human beings without political authority are not inevitably at war with one another, then the argument for absolute sovereign authority loses its primary support, because the argument depends on the contrast between the awfulness of the state of nature and the relative acceptability of even a bad sovereign. The state of nature description rests on specific assumptions about human psychology, that people are primarily motivated by fear and competitive desire for power, that they are essentially asocial in their fundamental interests, that they cannot sustain cooperative relationships without the external enforcement of a sovereign authority, that self-interest always dominates other regarding motivations when the two conflict. Each of these assumptions has been challenged, and the challenges are not merely theoretical, but grounded in evidence about how human beings actually behave. The anthropological evidence about small-scale societies, the societies that approximate most closely what life without state institutions looks like, is more complex than Hobbes's stark picture would suggest. Hunter-gatherer communities typically feature extensive cooperation, sophisticated mechanisms for enforcing social norms that do not require anything like a Hobbesian sovereign, genuine altruism and self-sacrifice in service of community members, and conflict resolution practices that operate through community pressure and consensus, rather than top-down coercion. This does not mean that small-scale societies are peaceful utopias. They are not, and violence is a real feature of many of them. But it does mean that the binary between Hobbesian war of all against all and Hobbesian sovereign authority is too simple to capture the range of social arrangements that human beings have actually developed and sustained. John Locke mounted the most historically influential philosophical challenge to Hobbes, and his challenge went to the root of the argument. The state of nature is not necessarily a state of war, Locke argued, because human beings in the state of nature are not purely self-interested calculating machines. They are rational beings, capable of recognizing the moral law that God has established, and reason can discover, a law that forbids unprovoked aggression and requires respect for the life, liberty, and property of others. The inconveniences of the state of nature are real but limited. They arise from the lack of a common judge to settle disputes and enforce natural law, not from the fundamental hostility of all to all. And therefore, the social contract that rational people would actually form is not the unlimited transfer of right that Hobbes described, but a much more limited arrangement. The creation of government with specific and innumerable purposes, accountable to the people it serves and justly overthrown when it fails to serve them. The Lockean objection is powerful, but it is vulnerable to a Hobbesian response that deserves to be taken seriously rather than assumed away. Hobbes would say, the question of whether human beings can recognize and follow natural law in the state of nature without external enforcement is not a question to be answered by armchair psychology. It is an empirical question, and the evidence relevant to answering it is the behavior of actual human beings in situations where political authority has broken down. And that evidence, the English Civil War, the 30 Years' War, the countless historical examples of what happens when the mechanisms of political order fail, does not support the Lockean picture of natural human cooperativeness, guided by rational recognition of natural law. It supports something considerably closer to Hobbes. David Hume's challenge was different in kind and in some ways more philosophically damaging. Hume argued that the social contract never actually happened and never could have happened in the form that contract theory describes. Political authority in actual human societies is not the product of explicit or implicit agreement among the people who are subject to it. It is the product of historical accident, military conquest, gradual customary development, the manipulation of the powerful, and the passive acceptance of the less powerful, none of which has anything to do with rational, deliberate consent. The social contract is a philosophical fiction, and a fiction that does not actually do the philosophical work it is supposed to do, because even if we accept it as a moral philosophical reconstruction rather than a historical description, the question of whether any actual government can claim the legitimacy that the reconstructed contract would confer remains genuinely open. The objections to absolute sovereignty are perhaps the most practically consequential, because they bear directly on the constitutional design questions that matter most for actual political life. Hobbes argued that divided sovereignty, any arrangement in which political authority was shared among competing institutions, any system of checks and balances, any mechanism for holding the sovereign accountable to standards that the sovereign itself did not create, necessarily produced the conditions of civil war, because divided authority always meant potentially competing authority, and competing authority always meant the possibility of conflict that the competing parties could not resolve without resort to force. 3.5 centuries of constitutional history have provided a reasonably definitive empirical test of this prediction, and the results do not support it. The constitutional democracies that developed after Hobbes, with their separated powers, their independent judiciaries, their protected individual rights, their mechanisms for peaceful transfer of authority, have proven in many cases more stable, more just, and more capable of providing the security that Hobbes identified as the point of political authority than the unified, absolute sovereignties he recommended. Part 11. Hobbes and Women, the Limits of the Social Contract. Any serious engagement with Hobbes must address with equal seriousness the question of who exactly is party to the social contract that he describes, whose interests it is designed to protect, whose consent is required for its formation, and what the exclusion of certain people from the category of genuine contracting parties reveals about the limits of even the most systematically argued political philosophy. The question of women in Hobbes's political thought is philosophically important, not because it is a marginal issue about historical attitudes, but because it goes to the heart of the tension between his philosophical first principles and their application. The tension between the radical implications of his premises and his failure to follow those implications where they actually led. On the surface, and at the level of the fundamental philosophical premises, Hobbes's account of human nature and the state of nature is radically egalitarian in a way that should have immediate and profound consequences for his account of who counts as a genuine political agent. The state of nature is a condition of approximate equality, and Hobbes is explicit that this equality applies to all human beings who are capable of threatening one another's survival, which is to say, essentially all adult human beings, women as surely as men. The fundamental drives of self-preservation, of appetite and aversion, of the competitive striving for power, these are features of human psychology as such, not features of male psychology specifically. The fear of violent death that grounds the entire argument for the social contract is a fear that women experience as fully and as rationally as men. If the argument for political authority rests on universal human psychology, and if women share that psychology, then women should be as fully party to the social contract as men. There is one remarkable passage in Hobbes that appears to push in exactly this direction. In his account of the state of nature, he discusses the question of who has authority over children and arrives at the conclusion that maternal authority is the natural default. Because in the state of nature, you know who the mother of a child is with certainty, and you often cannot know who the father is with the same certainty. The natural political authority over children therefore belongs, in the state of nature, to the mother. This is a striking position in a 17th century context where paternal authority over children was treated as not only natural, but divinely ordained, and where the entire structure of political authority was understood by analogy with paternal authority, the king as the father of his people. By making maternal authority the natural baseline, Hobbes undermined the patriarchal analogy at its root. But the subversive implications of this argument are not followed through into the account of political society. When Hobbes turns from the state of nature to the social contract and the political arrangements that the contract creates, women effectively disappear as independent political agents. The contracts and covenants that create political authority are made by heads of households, and women are assumed to be under the authority of the household's male head, whether as wives, daughters, or servants. The equality of the state of nature, which should have been politically decisive, is extinguished at the very moment of political society's formation, not through philosophical argument demonstrating that women's equality was a mistake, but through the simple, unstated assumption that the existing patriarchal social arrangements are the natural starting point for the social contract. This is a philosophical failure of the most revealing kind, because it is not a failure of argument within his system. It is a failure to apply the system's own principles consistently. The arguments he used to demolish the divine right of kings, the arguments that political authority cannot rest on mere assertions of natural superiority, that it must be grounded in the consent of those who are subject to it, that natural differences of capacity do not automatically generate political hierarchy, apply with equal force to the question of the authority of husbands over wives and fathers over daughters. If the king has no divine right to rule over his subjects simply by virtue of being king, then the husband has no natural right to rule over his wife simply by virtue of being male. The logic is exactly parallel, and Hobbes does not provide an argument for why the parallel does not hold. He simply assumes that it does not. Mary Astle, writing in the late 17th century with a directness that makes her one of the most philosophically interesting figures of the period, noticed this failure and stated it with devastating precision. If the subordination of subjects to political authority requires consent for its legitimacy, if Hobbes and the contract theorists are right that authority must be authorized by those who are subject to it, then why does the subordination of women to their husbands not require the same consent? If it is a philosophical error to say that kings have natural authority over their subjects by virtue of superior wisdom or lineage or divine appointment, why is it not the same philosophical error to say that husbands have natural authority over their wives by virtue of superior strength or biological difference? Astle was not herself a Democrat. She was, in certain respects, politically conservative. But she saw with perfect clarity that the principles of contract theory, applied consistently, required concluding that the authority of husbands over wives was no more natural or self-evident than the authority of kings over subjects. The consistent application of Hobbesian principles to questions of gender would have required concluding that women are equal parties to the social contract, with equal standing to demand the sovereign's protection and equal obligation to provide the sovereign with their political submission, as individuals, not as members of households governed by their male relatives. This conclusion was not available in the 17th century in any politically serious form. But it is an implication of the argument, and the fact that it is an implication that Hobbes did not draw reveals the most important thing about the relationship between philosophical principles and their social context. Principles are developed in contexts that constrain their application, and the constraints are often invisible to the people who are operating within them. Hobbes could see that the divine right of kings was an unjustified assertion of natural superiority. He could not see that the natural authority of husbands over wives was exactly the same kind of assertion. The analytical tools were available. The social imagination required to apply them in the relevant domain was not. Part 12. The Encounter with Parliament. Power and Accountability. No engagement with Hobbes's political philosophy is complete without a serious examination of its most sustained and most consequential intellectual confrontation. The argument with parliamentary constitutionalism that ran through the middle decades of the 17th century and that defined the terms of political philosophy in the English-speaking world for the century that followed. This was not merely an academic dispute. It was a philosophical argument conducted against the backdrop of a civil war that had killed hundreds of thousands of people and executed a king. And its resolution, or rather its non-resolution, the complex constitutional settlement that emerged from the Glorious Revolution of 1688, shaped the political institutions of England and eventually, through the American and British constitutional traditions, much of the modern democratic world. The parliamentary argument, at its most philosophically sophisticated, had several distinct strands that Hobbes engaged with separately and with varying degrees of success. The common law tradition, represented by figures like Edward Coke, argued that the authority of the king was bounded by the ancient and fundamental laws of England, laws so deep in the constitutional fabric that even the king could not unilaterally override them, laws whose content was known to and protected by the common law judges who interpreted them. The parliamentary tradition argued that Parliament, as the representative body of the English nation, had legitimate claims to participate in government that derived not from royal grant, but from something more fundamental, from the representative relationship between Parliament and the people, or from the ancient constitutional settlement that had always made parliamentary consent a condition of legitimate taxation and legislation. And the more radical tradition that emerged during the Civil War itself, the Levellers, the various sectarian republicans, argued for something closer to a genuine theory of popular sovereignty, in which ultimate political authority resided in the people and could be exercised to overturn governments that violated their fundamental rights. Hobbes saw in all of these traditions the same underlying philosophical error, manifested in different specific forms, the creation of competing sources of political authority within a single political community. The common law judge who claims the authority to tell the king that his command violates the fundamental law of England is asserting a claim to judicial authority that competes with and potentially overrides royal authority. The Parliament that claims the right to withhold its consent from royal taxation is asserting a legislative authority that competes with the king's authority to govern. The people who claim the right to overthrow a king who has violated their fundamental rights are asserting a popular sovereignty that competes with royal sovereignty. In every case, the result is the same. There are two claimants to final authority in the political community, and the question of whose authority prevails in cases of conflict cannot be resolved by appeal to any authority above both, because if there were such an authority, it would be the real sovereign, and both of the competing claimants would have to defer to it. This is, as a piece of analytical political philosophy, genuinely powerful. The problem of who decides, Who has the authority to determine what the constitutional limits on sovereignty require in a specific case, or whether the sovereign has violated those limits, is the fundamental problem of constitutional design, and Hobbes saw it with greater clarity than most of his contemporaries. Every system of constitutional limitations on sovereign authority must answer this question. When the sovereign and the constitution conflict, which prevails, and who decides? If the sovereign decides, then the limitations are not real constraints. If some other authority decides, a supreme court, a parliament, the people, then that other authority is effectively sovereign in the relevant domain, and you have divided sovereignty rather than limited sovereignty. Hobbes's point that divided sovereignty is structurally unstable, that competing claims to final authority will eventually produce violent conflict, is not obviously wrong and is supported by a great deal of historical evidence. But the constitutional history of the 3.5 centuries since Hobbes wrote has provided evidence that his prediction was too simple. The constitutional democracies that developed after his death, the English constitutional monarchy, the American Republic, the various constitutional systems of continental Europe, have maintained their divided and constrained sovereignties for extended periods without dissolving into civil war. They have done so through mechanisms that Hobbes's framework had no room for: conventions of constitutional practice, shared commitments to procedural legitimacy, habits of institutional deference, and the credible threat of popular resistance to constitutional violation that is always available as a last resort, but rarely needs to be deployed. The stability of constitutional democracy is not the stability of Hobbesian unified sovereignty, but it is a real and significant form of stability that his analysis cannot easily explain. What the encounter with Parliament ultimately reveals is both the power and the specific limitations of Hobbes's analytical framework. He was right that the problem of competing authorities is real, and that it generates instability. He was wrong that the only solution is to eliminate the competition by concentrating all authority in a single sovereign. The actual solution, if it can be called a solution since it is fragile and imperfect and constantly under pressure, is to create a culture of constitutional commitment strong enough to make the costs of violating constitutional rules prohibitively high, even for those with the formal power to violate them. This is not the kind of solution that Hobbes's framework, with its emphasis on the formal structure of authority and its skepticism about the motivating power of anything except self-interest and fear, was well positioned to recognize or explain. Part 13. Hobbes and International Relations. The permanent state of nature. There is one domain in which Hobbes does not merely hypothesize about the state of nature, but explicitly acknowledges that it describes a present and ongoing reality: the relations among sovereign states in the international arena. Between sovereigns, between the kings and princes and republics of the European state system, there is no common sovereign power capable of keeping them in awe. There is no third party with the authority to enforce agreements between them, no court whose judgments bind them, no power capable of punishing them for aggression or breach of promise. They exist in relation to one another in precisely the condition Hobbes describes as the domestic state of nature, a condition of perpetual competition, mutual distrust, and the ever-present background possibility of violent conflict. This acknowledgement is philosophically important and historically consequential. It is important because it shows that Hobbes's account of the state of nature is not purely a philosophical thought experiment, but a description of actual conditions that he observed in the international politics of his time. The European state system of the 17th century, the collection of sovereign states that had emerged from the wreckage of the medieval unity of Christendom and the catastrophe of the 30 Years' War, was genuinely analogous in its structure of relations to the domestic state of nature. States made treaties and broke them when breaking them was advantageous. They maintained permanent armies because they could not trust their neighbours' peaceful professions. They engaged in the same arms race dynamic that Hobbes described in the domestic state of nature. Each state increased its military capacity because every other state was increasing its military capacity, and each found itself no more secure at the end of the race than at the beginning, because the height relative position of all had remained roughly constant, while the absolute cost had increased enormously. The logical implication of this analysis, if we are looking for a solution to the international state of nature analogous to the solution Hobbes proposed for the domestic state of nature, is a world sovereign, a single political authority with the power to enforce agreements between states, to punish aggression, to settle disputes through binding decisions, rather than through the threat or use of force. Hobbes himself did not seriously propose this, and the reasons he did not are philosophically interesting. The same logic that generates the domestic social contract, the recognition that the state of nature is intolerable and that the best available escape from it is the creation of a common sovereign, should in principle generate an international social contract among sovereigns. But several features of the international situation make this analogical reasoning fail. Sovereign states are not individuals in the relevant sense. Individuals in the domestic state of nature are continuously vulnerable. They must eat, sleep, move, interact with others in ways that create constant exposure to attack. The urgency of their need for security is therefore immediate and extreme. Sovereign states can endure the discomforts and dangers of the international state of nature far longer than any individual can endure the domestic equivalent, because states have resources, institutions, and capabilities that allow them to maintain basic functioning under conditions of considerable external threat. The urgency that drives individuals to accept even very unfavorable terms in order to escape the domestic state of nature does not apply with the same force to states, which is part of the reason that the international state of nature has persisted as a permanent feature of international relations, rather than being superseded by a Hobbesian world contract. The realist tradition in international relations theory that emerged in the 20th century, associated with thinkers like E. H. Carr, Hans Morgenthau, and Kenneth Waltz, drew explicitly and repeatedly on Hobbesian analysis to provide the theoretical foundation for its core claims, that states in an anarchic international system will consistently prioritize their own security and power over any other consideration, that international cooperation will be limited and fragile because it depends on the continuing coincidence of national interests rather than on any enforceable common authority, that the structural features of the international system generate competitive behavior regardless of the preferences or intentions of individual statesmen. This Hobbesian analysis of international relations proved enormously influential, not just in academic international relations theory, but in the practical thinking of diplomats and strategists who found in its sober realism a more accurate guide to actual international behavior than the idealism of those who believed that international institutions could transform the structure of international relations through the progressive development of international law and organization. The contemporary relevance of this framework is striking and often uncomfortable. The international institutions that have been created since Hobbes's time, the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the World Trade Organization, the various treaty regimes that govern arms control, trade, human rights, and the global environment, all represent attempts to address the international state of nature without creating a genuine world sovereign. They rely on voluntary compliance, on the mutual interest of states in maintaining the norms that benefit them, and on the reputational costs of defection, mechanisms that Hobbes's analysis of the state of nature would predict to be systematically inadequate. And the empirical record is indeed mixed in ways consistent with the Hobbesian prediction. International institutions function well when they align with the interests of powerful states, poorly when they conflict with those interests, and collapse entirely when the most powerful states decide that their interests are better served by defection than by compliance. Part 14. The Persistence of Hobbes. Influence on Political Thought. Hobbes died in 1679 at the extraordinary age of 91, having outlived 3 English regimes and having maintained, under each of them, the same philosophical positions and the same intellectual productivity that had characterized his earlier career. He was still writing in his 80s, producing translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey when he had run out of philosophical targets. And he died in harness, in the intellectual traces he had worn for 6 decades. His philosophy survived him with considerably more difficulty and considerably more official hostility than its author had perhaps anticipated. Leviathan was publicly burned at Oxford in 1683. His works were placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum by the Catholic Church. Multiple attempts were made during his lifetime and after to have him prosecuted for heresy or atheism. For the better part of 2 centuries after his death, the official verdict on Hobbes in the English-speaking world was that he was dangerous, scandalous, and irreligious, a conclusion that did nothing to reduce his actual influence on subsequent political philosophy, and may, by the mechanism through which official condemnation always operates, have increased it. The influence of his thought on the subsequent tradition was pervasive and often unacknowledged, because the most direct acknowledgement of a philosopher whose views are officially beyond the pale is to engage with him without naming him. John Locke, who was the most influential political philosopher of the generation after Hobbes, and whose second treatise of government became the canonical statement of liberal political theory, was engaged in a sustained argument with Hobbesian positions throughout his work, even though he rarely named Hobbes directly. The state of nature concept, the central philosophical device of liberal political theory, the starting point from which the social contract is derived and against which political arrangements are justified, is a Hobbesian invention that Locke borrowed and transformed. The social contract as the mechanism of political legitimacy is a Hobbesian framework that Locke reformulated to reach radically different conclusions. Even the account of natural rights that Locke used to limit sovereign authority has Hobbesian roots. It was Hobbes who established self-preservation as the foundation of natural rights, and Locke who extended this foundation into the richer structure of life, liberty, and estate. Rousseau's engagement with Hobbes was more directly antagonistic and more explicit. Rousseau recognized, as Locke had not fully acknowledged, that the Hobbesian account of the state of nature was the most powerful available argument against his own view that human beings were naturally good and naturally free, and that the corruptions of civilization were the source of human misery rather than its cure. The social contract and the discourse on inequality can both be read as extended responses to the challenge that Hobbes had posed. If human nature in the state of nature is, as he describes, competitive, fearful, driven by the restless desire for power, then Rousseau's political program is impossible, because the kind of political community he envisioned requires from its members a capacity for genuine civic virtue that Hobbesian psychology rules out. Rousseau's response was to deny Hobbesian psychology at its root, to argue that the competitive, fearful, power-hungry psychology Hobbes described was not natural human psychology, but the product of civilization itself, of property, of inequality, of the corrupting influence of social comparison. In the state of nature, human beings were simple, peaceful, self-sufficient animals, incapable of the complex social competitions that Hobbes had identified as the source of the state of war. Kant's engagement was philosophically more sophisticated than either Locke's or Rousseau's, and in some respects more appreciative. Kant recognized that Hobbes had identified the fundamental problem of political philosophy with genuine precision, the problem of how to create stable, just political order among beings who are rational enough to see the advantages of cooperation, but self-interested enough to be tempted by defection, and that this problem required a philosophical solution of considerable depth. What Kant rejected was the specifically Hobbesian solution, the derivation of political obligation from fear and prudential calculation. A political order grounded in nothing but fear and self-interest was for Kant perpetually unstable in principle because it depended on circumstances that could change. What was required, he argued, was a grounding of political obligation in something more than prudence, in the recognition, by rational beings, that they must will the conditions for rational agency, including the legal and political institutions that protect it. The Kantian move was to transform the Hobbesian insight about the necessity of political authority into a requirement of practical reason itself. The utilitarian tradition found in Hobbes something closer to a philosophical ancestor than a philosophical opponent. Bentham and Mill, like Hobbes, were skeptical of appeals to natural rights and natural law that were not grounded in calculations of human welfare. Like Hobbes, they thought that political institutions should be designed and justified on the basis of what actually served human interests that were empirical facts about human psychology rather than metaphysical facts about human nature. The specific mechanism was different, Hobbesian fear versus utilitarian calculation of pleasure and pain, but the fundamental orientation toward human psychology as the foundation of political theory and away from theological or natural law grounding was shared in ways that make the intellectual lineage from Hobbes to Bentham plausible even without direct causal connections. Part 15. Hobbes in the Age of Democratic Revolution. The American and French revolutions of the late 18th century presented Hobbesian political philosophy with its most severe and most direct empirical challenge. These were not merely thought experiments about what rational people in the state of nature would agree to. They were actual historical events in which large numbers of people actually threw off existing sovereign authority, actually attempted to create new political orders on the basis of philosophical principles about consent and natural rights, and actually made the argument, which Hobbes had declared philosophically incoherent, that legitimate political authority required the genuine consent of the governed, and could be justly overthrown when it violated the rights it was supposed to protect. The American case was in important respects the more philosophically interesting of the two, because it was conducted, from beginning to end, in explicitly philosophical terms by people who had read widely in the political philosophy of the previous century and who were quite self-conscious about what they were doing and what principles they were acting on. The Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, the constitutional debates. These were all philosophical documents in the sense that they were attempting to ground political arrangements in philosophical principles, to justify not merely by appeal to historical precedent or religious authority, but by appeal to reason, to the nature of human beings, and to the logical requirements of legitimate government. The founding generation was primarily Lockean in its political philosophy, rather than Hobbesian. They appealed to natural rights, to the right of revolution against governments that violated those rights, to the principle that legitimate government required the consent of the governed, all of which are Lockean rather than Hobbesian positions. But the way they actually structured the government they created shows the influence of a more Hobbesian concern than their theoretical commitments would suggest. The separation of powers, the elaborate system of checks and balances, the explicit attention to what happens when political institutions are designed by people who are not angels, for a population that is not angelic. This is the design work of people who took seriously, even if they did not explicitly acknowledge, the Hobbesian insight that political institutions must be designed for human nature as it actually is, not as it ought to be. The French Revolution was a more direct test of the Hobbesian prediction, and a more uncomfortable one for those who found his conclusions about the necessity of strong sovereign authority too stark. The revolution began with the explicit rejection of existing sovereign authority, the authority of the Ancien Régime, on the grounds that it violated the natural rights of the French people. It proceeded through a rapid succession of regimes: constitutional monarchy, republic, radical republic, the terror, the Thermidorian reaction, the Directory, the Consulate, the Empire, each one destroying the previous in the name of philosophical principles about legitimate authority. And it ended less than 2 decades after the storming of the Bastille, with Napoleon Bonaparte, a military strongman whose authority rested not on any philosophical theory of consent or natural right, but on his actual capacity to govern effectively and to maintain order. This trajectory looks, from a Hobbesian perspective, disturbingly like a demonstration of his central thesis. The destruction of established sovereign authority did not produce the freedom and justice that the revolutionaries had promised. It produced a period of violent chaos, the Terror, that killed tens of thousands of people, many of them the revolutionaries themselves. And from that chaos, the French population escaped not into the enlightened democratic republic of philosophical theory, but into the arms of a sovereign whose primary claim to authority was effectiveness rather than legitimacy. Napoleon was not chosen through any genuine process of social contract. He rose to power because he was the person capable of providing, after a decade of catastrophic disorder, the basic political good that Hobbes had identified as the most fundamental: the suppression of the state of nature and the provision of security. But the Hobbesian reading of the French Revolution is also too simple, and acknowledging this requires confronting the limits of the Hobbesian framework. The Terror, the period of systematic political violence conducted by the Revolutionary Committee of Public Safety against its enemies, real and imagined, was not the state of nature. It was a sovereign power exercising violence against its own subjects with the systematic efficiency that only a functioning state apparatus can provide. The victims of the Terror were not killed in the chaos of the state of nature. They were killed by the deliberate decisions of a government that claimed, in Hobbesian terms, to be the legitimate sovereign of France and to be acting in the name of the people who had authorized it. Hobbes's framework, which identifies the sovereign with the provision of order and security, has no resources for distinguishing between the legitimate sovereign and the terrorist state, between the government that protects its people and the government that murders them in the name of protecting them. Part 16. The Language of Power, Hobbes and Political Vocabulary. One of the most significant and most persistently underappreciated dimensions of Hobbes's intellectual achievement is his contribution to the vocabulary, the specific technical vocabulary, of political philosophy. The concepts he defined, the distinctions he drew, the terms he invented or transformed, have become so deeply embedded in the language of political thought that people who have never read a word of Leviathan deploy them daily without knowing their origin, without recognizing that what seems like a natural and obvious way of framing political questions was in fact a specific philosophical invention of the mid-17th century. The concept of sovereignty, understood specifically as the unlimited, indivisible and final authority to make and enforce law within a political community, is, in the precise technical form that has shaped every subsequent discussion, a Hobbesian contribution. The word existed before Hobbes. Jean Bodin had used it to describe the highest authority in a state. But Hobbes gave it a philosophical precision and a set of necessary implications that transformed it from a descriptive term into a theoretical concept with determinate content. After Hobbes, sovereignty meant not merely the highest power in a state, but the final power, the power that could not be limited, divided, or made accountable to any higher authority within the political community, because any such limitation or division or accountability mechanism would itself constitute a competing source of authority and would thereby destroy the unity that makes sovereignty what it is. This precise and demanding concept of sovereignty, with its implication that genuine political authority is necessarily unlimited in scope, though not in the reach of its actual commands, is the concept that all subsequent political philosophy has had to position itself in relation to, whether by embracing it, modifying it, or explicitly rejecting it. The concept of the state of nature, the philosophical hypothetical of what human life would be like without political authority, is an invention that transformed the fundamental question of political philosophy. Before Hobbes, political philosophers asked questions about the best form of government, about the proper relationship between rulers and ruled, about the conditions under which rebellion was justified, about the divine source of political authority. These are all questions asked from within political society, presupposing its existence and asking about how it should be arranged. Hobbes introduced a different and more fundamental question. What is political society for? And to answer this question, he introduced the device of imagining the absence of political society, the state of nature, and asking what that condition would be like. The state of nature concept forces political philosophy to be explicit about its assumptions regarding human nature, because the character of the state of nature depends entirely on those assumptions. It requires a counterfactual analysis, a systematic thought experiment, rather than merely a description and evaluation of existing arrangements. This methodological demand, which now seems obvious and almost inevitable, was Hobbes's invention. The concept of authorization, the idea that political authority derives its legitimacy from an act of authorization by those who are subject to it, is a Hobbesian contribution that became foundational for democratic theory, even as the specific Hobbesian use of it was rejected by subsequent democratic thinkers. The idea that those who are governed must in some sense be the authors of the authority that governs them, that legitimate political authority cannot simply be asserted or inherited or revealed by God, but must somehow derive from those who are subject to it, is at the core of every theory of democratic legitimacy. Hobbes arrived at this idea through a route that led to conclusions no Democrat could accept. But the idea itself, that authority must be authorized, entered the mainstream of political thought through his arguments and has been at the center of political philosophy ever since. His nominalism, his view that the general terms we use in political argument, terms like justice, right, liberty, obligation, commonwealth, are names rather than descriptions of independently existing things, that their meaning is determined by convention and use rather than by reference to natural kinds or transcendent moral facts, had implications for political philosophy that are still being worked out. If justice is a name rather than a thing, then political disputes about what justice requires cannot be resolved by discovering facts about justice. They can only be resolved by the authority that has the right to determine how the name is used. If rights are names rather than things, then the question of what rights people have is not a matter of discovery, but of political decision. The nominalist position in political philosophy, which carries enormous and uncomfortable implications for the entire natural rights tradition, is present in Hobbes and has been influencing political philosophy ever since, often without explicit acknowledgement of where it came from. His contribution to the theory of obligation, to the philosophical account of what makes it the case that political authority genuinely binds rather than merely coerces, is philosophically significant in ways that are still debated. He wanted to explain not just why it was prudent to obey the sovereign, but why you were genuinely obligated to do so, what the normative basis of political obligation was, above and beyond the simple calculation that compliance paid. His answer, that obligation derives from authorization, from the act of making the sovereign your representative, was philosophically sophisticated and philosophically contested, and the contest it generated produced the most important theoretical developments in the philosophy of political obligation in the subsequent 3 centuries. Every subsequent theory of political obligation, whether it grounds obligation in consent in fairness, in the natural duty to support just institutions, or in some other basis, is responding to the challenge that Hobbes posed. Part 17. Hobbes and Modernity, the philosopher who never left. Hobbes died more than 3 centuries ago, and he has not stayed dead in any philosophically meaningful sense. He keeps returning, in every period of political crisis, in every moment when the fragility of political order becomes suddenly and terrifyingly visible, as a philosopher whose questions and whose analysis refuse to become merely historical curiosities. The man who stared at civil war and derived from it a philosophy of political order has proven to be one of the most renewable and most practically relevant figures in the entire history of political thought, precisely because of the question he was asking. What holds political order together, and what happens when it falls apart? Does not have a historical answer that settles it once and for all. It has to be asked again, in every era, against the specific forms that political disorder takes in that era's specific circumstances. The 20th century provided the most comprehensive and most catastrophic test of Hobbesian political philosophy that history has yet produced. The collapse of political order in Russia, Germany, and across Central Europe after the First World War, the rise of totalitarian regimes that demonstrated with terrible thoroughness what happens when unlimited sovereign power falls into the hands of rulers who use it not to protect their subjects, but to prey on them. The genocides and civil wars and failed states that marked the century from its first decade to its last. All of these developments were developments that Hobbesian analysis illuminated even when it was insufficient to the full horror of what was actually occurring. The diagnostic power of the Hobbesian framework, its ability to identify the conditions under which political order would break down and violence would escalate, was demonstrated repeatedly, if grimly, by the events of the century. Carl Schmitt, the most intellectually formidable and most morally compromised political thinker of the early 20th century, found in Hobbes the philosophical foundation he needed for his theory of sovereignty as the power of exception. The power to decide when the normal rules of political life should be suspended in the name of the emergency that those rules could not address. Schmitt read Hobbes as a philosopher of decision rather than of calculation, of the sovereign will rather than of the rational contract. And this reading, whatever its historical accuracy as an interpretation, produced a theoretical framework that was philosophically powerful and politically catastrophic. Schmitt went on to join the Nazi Party and provide intellectual legitimacy for the regime. The Hobbesian concepts he deployed were twisted in the process, but the fact that they could be twisted in that direction reveals something genuine about their ambiguity, a philosophy that grounds political authority primarily in effectiveness and that provides no principled basis for distinguishing between a government that protects its people and one that preys on them, can be put to uses that its author would not have endorsed. The problem of failed states, which became one of the defining political problems of the late 20th and early 21st centuries as colonial empires dissolved, as the Cold War structure that had imposed a kind of order on the developing world fell apart, and as civil conflicts erupted across Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, is in important respects the Hobbesian problem made visible on the contemporary global stage. Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, after the 2003 invasion, Syria, Libya, Yemen. These are real-world approximations of the Hobbesian state of nature, and the Hobbesian prediction of what that condition would look like has been confirmed with terrible fidelity. The productivity collapses, the displacement of populations, the breakdown of all the ordinary mechanisms of social cooperation, the extreme violence that becomes rational for every participant under conditions where defection is the dominant strategy. These are Hobbesian phenomena, and the politicians and policymakers and humanitarian workers who have had to engage with them have found themselves, whether they knew it or not, working with Hobbesian problems that required Hobbesian analysis. The contemporary relevance extends to the newest, and in some respects the most challenging forms of political competition, the competition in cyberspace, the use of social media to undermine public trust in political institutions, the deliberate seeding of misinformation designed to erode the epistemic foundations on which shared political life depends. These are new forms of an old Hobbesian problem. the problem of how to maintain the shared expectations and the settled authority that make political order possible in the face of actors who have both the incentive and the means to undermine them. The Hobbesian analysis suggests that the challenge is not primarily military or technological, but philosophical. The question is whether a political community can maintain the shared commitment to the institutional arrangements that protect it in the face of continuous and sophisticated attempts to persuade each member of the community that those arrangements are not to be trusted. The Leviathan, in the 21st century, is under attack not primarily by armies, but by arguments, by the systematic erosion of the confidence in sovereign authority that the sovereign's legitimacy requires. Part 18. The Complete Vision, Integration and Contemporary Application. Hobbes's philosophy, assembled from the geometric rigor of Leviathan, the historical experience of civil war and exile, the systematic account of human nature built on materialist foundations, and the unflinching analysis of what political authority is and what it costs, forms a coherent and challenging whole even across the vast distance of more than 3.5 centuries. Its coherence is the coherence of a single organizing question. What makes political order possible, and what is the honest price of it? Pursued with extraordinary consistency, and without the concessions to comfortable conventional wisdom that make philosophy palatable but less true. And its application to contemporary life is, if anything, more pressing than it was in 17th century England, because the mechanisms for political order that Hobbes analysed have become vastly more complex, more globally interdependent, more technologically sophisticated, and in certain fundamental respects, not more but less stable than the arrangements he was attempting to understand. The first and most fundamental application of Hobbesian philosophy to contemporary life is the practice of taking seriously the problem of political order as a problem, not treating political stability as a natural default condition that simply exists unless something extraordinary goes wrong, but recognizing it as a genuine achievement that requires continuous maintenance, that depends on specific institutional arrangements and specific habits and cultures of compliance, that can erode gradually and invisibly in ways that only become visible when it is very late in the erosion process, and that can collapse with a speed and completeness that surprises everyone who has not been paying attention to the conditions of its maintenance. Political stability feels permanent from inside a stable political order, in the same way that structural integrity feels permanent from inside a well-built building. Both are maintained by specific material arrangements and conditions, and when those arrangements and conditions fail, the failure can be sudden and catastrophic in ways that the period of apparent stability gave no indication of. The second application concerns what might be called the economics of legitimacy, the relationship between the formal legitimacy of political authority and its actual capacity to perform the functions that legitimacy is supposed to serve. Hobbes argued, in effect, that legitimacy and effectiveness are not two separate properties that political authority can have in varying degrees, independently of each other. They are deeply connected. A sovereign that cannot provide security is not merely an ineffective legitimate authority. It is not really a sovereign at all in the sense that matters. Contemporary political science has developed this insight into a research program, studying the conditions under which political institutions generate and maintain legitimacy, the mechanisms through which legitimacy is eroded, and the relationship between perceived legitimacy and actual compliance with political authority. This research program is, in important ways, an empirical investigation of the phenomena that Hobbes analysed philosophically, and the findings of the research are often more consonant with his analysis than his critics would prefer. The third application is the Hobbesian analysis of collective action problems. the structural situations in which individually rational behavior produces collectively irrational outcomes, and in which the only solution is an authority capable of changing the individual incentive structure through the enforcement of cooperation. Hobbes saw this structure clearly in the context of the state of nature and the social contract, but the structure applies far beyond the political context to which he applied it. It applies to the regulation of markets, where individually rational profit-seeking produces externalities that are collectively harmful and that the market has no internal mechanism to correct. It applies to environmental problems, where individually rational use of common resources produces the degradation of those resources in ways that are collectively catastrophic. It applies to arms races, to public health, to the maintenance of public infrastructure, to virtually every domain in which individual decisions aggregate into collective outcomes that diverge sharply from what anyone would choose if they were choosing for the collective. The fourth application is the Hobbesian account of the role of fear in political psychology, and specifically the role of the fear of violent death as a political motivator of particular power and particular rationality. Hobbes argued that the fear of violent death was not a weakness or an irrationality, but the most reasonable response available to a rational creature confronting the realities of the state of nature, and that the political institutions designed to address this fear were therefore not concessions to irrationality, but expressions of the most fundamental form of political reason. Contemporary political psychology has documented, in ways that go considerably beyond what Hobbes could have known, the extraordinary power of fear as a motivating force in political behavior. Its ability to override other values, to sharpen the distinction between in-group and out-group, to generate compliance with authority, and to be deliberately exploited by political actors who understand its power and are willing to use it. The fifth application is the problem of authority and expertise in a world of radical informational complexity. Hobbes's argument for unified sovereign authority was grounded in part on the observation that the existence of multiple competing sources of authority, multiple voices capable of telling subjects what they were obligated to do and what they were permitted to refuse, was inherently destabilizing, because subjects could not simultaneously comply with all of them, and any choice among them was an act of political judgment that implicitly challenged the authority of those not chosen. The contemporary equivalent of this problem is the proliferation of competing information sources, each claiming authority, each contesting the authority of others, each capable of reaching large populations with persuasive messages, and the resulting erosion of the shared epistemic framework on which the kind of settled authority Hobbes described depended. A society in which no source of information is trusted by more than a fraction of the population is a society in which the shared expectations that make political order possible are continuously under threat. The sixth application is the relationship between the provision of security and the maintenance of civil liberty. The perennial and never finally resolved tension between what Hobbes identified as the point of political authority and what liberal political philosophy has identified as the primary constraint on it. Hobbes's framework insists that this tension must always be resolved, in the end, in favor of security, because liberty without security is not liberty in any meaningful sense. It is the formal freedom of the state of nature, which no one actually wants once they understand what it costs. Contemporary liberal political philosophy has generally insisted on the opposite priority. Liberty is primary, and security arrangements must be designed so that they do not unnecessarily constrain it. The actual constitutional and legal practice of the most developed political orders generally falls somewhere between these positions, resolving specific cases through political struggle and legal interpretation, rather than through the application of any settled philosophical principle. But the tension is real, it is permanent, and Hobbes's insistence on taking the security side of it seriously, on recognizing that the alternative to constrained liberty is not unconstrained liberty but the state of nature, is a philosophical contribution that the liberty-first tradition has never fully answered. The seventh and final application is intellectual honesty about the actual foundations of political order, an honesty that Hobbes demanded of himself, and that he applied to his analysis of the political world with a consistency that made him enemies in every political faction. His analysis stripped away the comfortable legitimizing stories that political authorities tell about themselves. The divine right of kings, the natural authority of the wise, the inevitable progress of enlightened democracy, and replaced them with a bleaker and more honest account. Political authority rests on the fear of the people who are subject to it, on the calculation that submission is better than the alternative, and on the specific institutional arrangements that make the calculations stable over time. This is not a flattering picture of political life, and it is not designed to make anyone feel better about the political arrangements under which they live. It is designed to be true. Conclusion: the courage to face the state of nature. We began with a man who described life without government as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and who, in saying so, created the most powerful philosophical argument for political order in the history of the discipline. We end with a question. What do you do with this philosophy? How do you take Hobbes's radical, demanding, unflinching vision, a vision of political life stripped of every consoling illusion, grounded in the most honest available account of human nature and political necessity, and use it to think and live and govern better in the specific circumstances of your actual political world? The answer begins with a form of political honesty that is harder than it sounds. You are not living in a natural condition. You are living in an artificial condition, one created and maintained by specific institutional arrangements that are not self-sustaining, that require continuous effort and continuous legitimacy and continuous investment to maintain, and that can fail in ways that reveal, suddenly and terrifyingly, what lies beneath them. The peace and security that make your life possible, that allow you to work, to form relationships, to plan for the future, to pursue the activities that give life its depth and meaning, are not default conditions of human existence. They are achievements produced by specific political arrangements that are genuinely vulnerable, that have failed before and will fail again, and that require something more than passive enjoyment to sustain. This recognition requires a kind of political seriousness that is rarer than the possession of political opinions and more demanding than the maintenance of political convictions. Physical courage is the willingness to risk bodily harm in the service of something important. Intellectual courage is the willingness to follow an argument to a conclusion that challenges your prior commitments. The courage that Hobbes exemplified was something beyond both. The willingness to look at the political life of his world without the consolations of natural law, divine right, natural human goodness, or the progressive improvement of history toward its predetermined rational destination. The courage to face the state of nature honestly, to recognize that political order is fragile, and that its fragility is not curable by the right constitutional design or the right philosophical education, but only manageable through the continuous and intelligent maintenance of the institutions and habits and cultures that produce it, is, in Hobbes's account, the precondition for thinking clearly about politics at all. But this political seriousness does not require, and should not require, the adoption of Hobbes's specific conclusions about the form that political order must take. The version of Hobbesian seriousness that is available to most citizens in most political communities is not a call for absolute sovereign authority or the abandonment of constitutional limitations. It is something more modest and more practically urgent. The recognition that political stability is an achievement worth protecting, even at the cost of accepting political decisions you find objectionable. The recognition that the mechanisms of legitimate political authority, elections, courts, legislatures, the rule of law, are worth defending, not because they always produce just outcomes, but because the alternative to those mechanisms is worse. The recognition that the erosion of trust in political institutions, however understandable given their specific failures, carries costs that are rarely visible in the moment of erosion and become catastrophically visible only after it is too late. Hobbes would say, and the evidence of the subsequent centuries supports him in this, that the greatest political dangers come not from tyrants, but from philosophical errors. The tyrant who rules by force is a political problem with a political solution. Sufficient force to overthrow the tyrant, or sufficient institutional structure to constrain the tyrannical impulse. But the philosophical error that convinces a population that the institutions of political order are not worth defending, that the specific forms of political legitimacy under which they live are corrupt or captured or fundamentally illegitimate. This is a danger that political force cannot address, because it operates at the level of the ideas and commitments that make political force legitimate in the first place. The person who has been convinced that no government deserves their compliance is not a rebel who can be punished back into submission. They are a potential citizen of the state of nature, waiting for conditions to make that state of nature actual. The sword and the crozier that the Leviathan holds in the famous frontispiece, the instruments of civil and religious authority united in the same massive artificial hand, are not symbols of tyranny. They are symbols of the unity of authority that Hobbes believed was necessary for political life to be possible at all. They represent the aspiration, never fully realized but never fully abandonable, to a political order that is coherent enough to settle disputes, powerful enough to enforce its settlements, and legitimate enough to generate the compliance of its subjects without relying entirely on force. Whether that aspiration can be realized through constitutional democracy rather than absolute sovereignty. Whether the divided and constrained authority that modern democratic states embody is stable enough to do the philosophical work that Hobbes assigned to the Leviathan is a question that 3.5 centuries of constitutional history have answered provisionally in the affirmative, but only provisionally, and only by continuous effort of the kind that Hobbes's analysis makes clear is permanently necessary. The man who was born alongside fear, who fled to Paris when his country began to destroy itself, who spent 11 years in exile working out in geometric detail why political order was necessary and what it required, who returned to England to submit to the effective sovereign of the moment because his own theory told him he had no basis for doing otherwise, who spent the last decades of his life under official suspicion and still kept writing. This man did the most important thing that a philosopher of politics can do. He refused to make political life more comfortable to contemplate by making it less true to describe. He insisted on the most honest available account of what human beings are and what political authority therefore has to be, regardless of how much that account offended the parties who preferred a different story. The uninteresting Leviathan is still with us. It is threatened, in our time, not primarily by armies or rebels, but by the erosion of the shared commitments and shared expectations on which all political order depends, by the corrosion of institutional trust, by the fragmentation of the epistemic commons, by the deliberate cultivation of the political nihilism that tells citizens that all politics is corruption, all authority is illegitimate, all institutions are captured, and therefore no institution deserves the compliance that makes political life possible. Hobbes understood that the precondition of political life is not perfect institutions, but sufficient shared commitment to imperfect ones. That understanding, arrived at through the experience of watching a political order collapse and the long intellectual labour of understanding why, is his gift to us. Hobbes lived to 91. He worked until he could no longer hold a pen, and then he dictated. He was, until the very end, the philosopher who refused to stop asking the most uncomfortable questions, because he had grasped with absolute clarity that the comfortable answers were the most dangerous ones. The lesson he leaves is not a reassuring one. It is the most valuable kind, the kind that is honestly derived, carefully argued, and irreducibly true.